I was drinking my morning coffee on the back deck when I heard the sound of a diesel engine rumbling down Oakmont Drive, and I knew immediately something was wrong because construction vehicles were forbidden in Whispering Pines unless you had written approval from the HOA board at least 2 weeks in advance. I walked around the side of my house just in time to see a flatbed truck backing into my driveway, and standing next to it with a clipboard was Patricia Hendricks, the president of our homeowners association, wearing her trademark khaki capris and a visor that said, "Whispering Pines, where neighbors become family." My name is Aaron Dalton, and I had been living in this planned community outside Phoenix, Arizona for 3 years. I moved here after my divorce because I wanted a fresh start somewhere quiet, and Whispering Pines seemed perfect with its manicured lawns, walking trails, and community pool. What I did not realize when I signed those closing papers was that the HOA rules were 67 pages long, and Patricia enforced every single one like her life depended on it. I jogged down my driveway as the truck driver started unloading massive decorative boulders onto a pallet jack. Each boulder was easily 3 feet in diameter, smooth river rock that probably weighed 300 pounds apiece. "Patricia, what the hell is going on?" I called out. She turned to me with that tight smile she always wore, the one that never reached her eyes. "Good morning, Aaron. I am glad you are here to witness this improvement to our community standards." "Improvement? Those are boulders. Why are they on my property?" Patricia consulted her clipboard like she was reading a court document. As per Section 42, subsection D of the Whispering Pines HOA covenant, all driveways must maintain a minimum setback of 18 inches from the property line. Your driveway violates this requirement by extending approximately 24 inches over the line, encroaching onto common area property. I stared at her in disbelief. My driveway has been the exact same width since the house was built in 2019. You are telling me that after all this time, it is suddenly a problem? "The previous board failed to enforce many regulations," Patricia said primly. "Since I became president 8 months ago, I have been systematically addressing these violations. You received a notice about this 3 weeks ago." I received a notice saying my driveway needed to be inspected, nothing about boulders or blocking anything. The truck driver, a weathered man in his 50s, looked uncomfortable as he continued unloading. There were 6 boulders total, and I watched in growing horror as Patricia directed him to place them along the edge of my driveway, effectively creating a barrier that would make it impossible to park my truck or access my garage. "This is insane," I said, pulling out my phone. "You cannot just block my driveway. That is illegal." "Actually, we can," Patricia replied. "The boulders are being placed on HOA common property, not your personal property. And before you threaten legal action, I suggest you read page 49 of your covenant, which clearly states that the HOA has the right to install barriers, fences, or landscaping features on common areas as deemed necessary by the board." "Deemed necessary?" "Patricia, I need to be able to use my driveway. How am I supposed to get to work?" She gestured vaguely toward the street. "Street parking is available, though you will need to move your vehicle every 72 hours per city ordinance. Or you could choose to bring your driveway into compliance by having it professionally recut to the proper setback." "Do you have any idea what that would cost?" "I imagine somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000, based on quotes I've seen for similar work. But that's not really my concern, Aaron. My concern is maintaining the property values and aesthetic standards of Whispering Pines." The truck driver finished placing the last boulder and had Patricia sign his paperwork. As he drove away, I stood there looking at the massive rocks that now formed a perfect barrier along the edge of my driveway. My extended cab pickup truck was still parked in the garage, and it was going to stay there unless I could somehow levitate it over 3-foot boulders. "This is not over," I told Patricia. "I certainly hope not," she said pleasantly. "You have 30 days to bring your property into compliance, or the HOA will begin assessing daily fines of $100. Have a wonderful day, Aaron." She walked back to her golf cart, which she drove around the neighborhood looking for violations, and puttered away toward the community center. I stood in my driveway, or what was left of it, and tried to figure out my next move. I called my office and told them I would be working from home today, then spent the next 2 hours researching Arizona HOA laws. What I found was not encouraging. HOAs in Arizona had broad authority to enforce their covenants, and unless you could prove they were acting in bad faith or violating specific state statutes, judges typically sided with the association. I pulled out my closing documents and found the covenant Patricia kept referencing. Sure enough, buried in the dense legal language was the section about driveway setbacks. But here was the thing that made my blood boil. My driveway had been professionally surveyed and approved by both the county and the HOA before construction. I had the paperwork in my files. The original developer had built 50 houses in Whispering Pines, and at least a dozen of them had driveways identical to mine. Why was I being singled out? The answer came 2 days later when I ran into my neighbor, Frank Simmons, while checking my mail. Frank was in his 70s, retired from the Air Force, and had lived in Whispering Pines since the first house was built. "Heard about your boulder problem," he said, shaking his head. "Patricia is on a rampage lately. Do you know why she's targeting me specifically?" Frank glanced around like he was worried about being overheard. "You voted against her at the last board meeting, did you not? When she wanted to increase HOA dues by 30%? I'd almost forgotten about that. 6 months ago, Patricia had proposed a massive increase to fund what she called enhanced community amenities, which seemed to mostly involve decorative landscaping and a new fountain for the entrance. I had been one of the homeowners who spoke against it during the open comment period, and the measure had ultimately failed. "You think this is retaliation?" "I know it is," Frank said. "She did the same thing to the Mitchells when they opposed her proposal to ban basketball hoops. Suddenly they were getting violation notices for their mailbox being the wrong shade of brown and their grass being a 1/4 inch too tall. They ended up selling their house and moving to Scottsdale. That is insane. That is Patricia. She treats this HOA like her personal fiefdom. The only reason she got elected president is because nobody else wanted the job, and now we are all stuck with her petty tyranny." I thanked Frank for the information and went back inside, but my mind was racing. If this was retaliation for exercising my rights as a homeowner, that might actually be grounds for legal action. I called a real estate attorney whose name I found online and explained the situation. Her name was Jennifer Wu, and she listened patiently before delivering news I did not want to hear. "You could pursue a claim for selective enforcement," she said, "but these cases are difficult to prove and expensive to litigate. You would need to document that other homeowners have identical violations that are not being enforced, gather evidence of the HOA president's retaliatory intent, and even then, you are looking at months or years of legal proceedings. Most judges are reluctant to interfere with HOA governance unless there is clear evidence of fraud or discrimination. So I'm just supposed to let her get away with this? You could try going through the HOA's internal dispute resolution process. Most covenants require it before you can file a lawsuit anyway. Request a hearing before the full board, present your evidence, and see if you can get the other board members to overrule Patricia's decision." That actually sounded like reasonable advice. I thanked her and hung up, then immediately sent a formal written request for a hearing to the HOA board, citing the dispute resolution section of the covenant. Under the rules, they had to schedule a hearing within 30 days. Meanwhile, I still had the problem of my truck being trapped in the garage. I'd been using my old Honda sedan, which I kept parked on the street, but that was not a long-term solution. The truck was my work vehicle. I am a general contractor, and I needed it to haul tools, materials, and equipment to job sites. That weekend, I borrowed a heavy-duty dolly from my friend Marcus and tried to see if I could somehow maneuver the boulders myself. Each one weighed at least 300 pounds, probably closer to 400. Even with the dolly and leverage, I could barely budge them. They were not going anywhere without heavy machinery. Which gave me an idea. I owned a small excavator, a Bobcat E35 that I used for site work and landscaping jobs. It was currently at a job site in Tempe, but I could bring it home. The excavator could easily move those boulders anywhere I wanted. But if I moved them off the HOA common property and onto my own driveway, Patricia would just claim I was destroying HOA property and hit me with more fines. The thought percolated in my brain for several days. Where could I move the boulders that would be perfectly legal, but also send a clear message that I was not going to be pushed around? The answer came to me while I was driving past Patricia's house on Sycamore Court. She had the largest lot in Whispering Pines, almost half an acre, with an expansive front lawn that she kept obsessively manicured. The lawn was technically her private property, but it was also the showpiece she constantly pointed to when lecturing other homeowners about maintaining community standards. I started making calls. First, I contacted the City of Phoenix Planning Department and confirmed that the boulders had been placed on property designated as HOA Common Area. That meant they belonged to the HOA collectively, not to Patricia personally. Second, I reviewed the HOA covenant again and found an interesting clause. Any homeowner could request the relocation of common area features if they presented a safety concern or interfered with the reasonable use and enjoyment of their property. Third, I called Marcus, who owned a flatbed trailer large enough to transport my excavator. "You're really going to do this?" he asked when I explained my plan. "She blocked my driveway with 400-pound rocks, Marcus. I'm not going to spend $10,000 recutting concrete because she is on a power trip." "Man, I love it. When do you need the trailer?" We scheduled it for the following Tuesday. I submitted my formal request to relocate the boulders to the HOA board, citing Section 12, subsection F, about safety concerns. I noted that the boulders created a hazard by preventing emergency vehicle access to my garage and interfered with my reasonable use of my property. Per the covenant, the board had 10 business days to respond to relocation requests. I did not expect them to approve it, but the covenant did not actually say I had to wait for approval, only that I had to submit the request. It was a loophole, and I was going to drive my excavator right through it. Tuesday morning arrived with clear skies and temperatures already climbing toward 90 degrees. Marcus showed up at 7 in the morning with the flatbed trailer. We drove to Tempe, loaded the Bobcat excavator, and had it back at Whispering Pines by 9:30. I had timed this carefully. Patricia's golf cart patrols usually started around 10, and I wanted to be well underway before she realized what was happening. I unloaded the excavator in the street, fired it up, and felt the satisfying rumble of the diesel engine. The neighbors were definitely noticing. I saw curtains twitching in windows up and down Oakmont Drive. The Bobcat's hydraulic arm made quick work of the first boulder. I positioned the bucket underneath, lifted it clear off the ground, and swung it around to load it onto Marcus's trailer. The whole operation took maybe 3 minutes. I was loading the third boulder when Patricia came racing up in her golf cart, her visor slightly askew and her face flushed with anger. "What do you think you are doing?" she shrieked over the sound of the excavator. I shut off the engine and climbed down. "Relocating these boulders, Patricia. They present a safety hazard and interfere with my reasonable use of my property. I submitted the proper request form to the board last week." "You cannot just move HOA property without approval." I pulled out a printed copy of the covenant and showed her Section 12, subsection F. "Actually, I can submit a request," which I did. The board has 10 days to respond, but nothing in the covenant says I have to wait for a response before taking action to address an immediate safety concern. This is not a safety concern. This is vandalism. Really? Because I would argue that blocking someone's driveway with immovable objects creates a fire hazard. What happens if there is an emergency and fire trucks need to access my garage? What if I need to evacuate quickly? You created a dangerous situation. Patricia, I am fixing it. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police." "Go ahead. These boulders are on common property, which means they belong to all the homeowners collectively. I am a homeowner. I'm relocating common property within the community. No law is being broken." 2 police officers arrived about 20 minutes later. I'd finished loading all 6 boulders onto the trailer by then and was sitting in the excavator's cab, waiting. Patricia was practically vibrating with rage as she explained to the officers that I was stealing HOA property. The older of the 2 officers, whose name tag read Rodriguez, listened patiently and then asked to see the property survey. I showed him the documents proving the boulders had been placed on common area property, not on Patricia's personal property or mine. I also showed him my formal request to relocate them and the relevant section of the HOA covenant. Officer Rodriguez studied the papers for several minutes, then handed them back to me. "Madam, This appears to be a civil HOA dispute. The property in question is jointly owned by all homeowners in the association. Without evidence of theft or vandalism to private property, there is no criminal matter here. But he is moving them without permission. That is something you will need to resolve through your HOA board or in civil court. We cannot intervene in HOA disputes unless there is evidence of an actual crime. Patricia looked like she was about to explode, but the officers were already getting back in their patrol car. As they drove away, she turned to me with pure venom in her eyes. "Where are you taking those boulders, Aaron?" "Somewhere safe," I said. "Do not worry, they will still be in Whispering Pines. I am not stealing HOA property." I climbed back into the excavator and followed Marcus's truck as he slowly drove through the neighborhood. We took a right on Sycamore Court, drove 3 houses down, and stopped directly in front of Patricia's pristine lawn. I unloaded the excavator again, while a growing crowd of neighbors gathered to watch. Patricia was screaming into her phone, probably calling every board member and possibly her lawyer. I did not care. I positioned the excavator carefully, lifted the first boulder off the trailer, and placed it gently on her front lawn, right next to her decorative stone mailbox. The boulder sank slightly into the grass, leaving a satisfying divot. I added the second boulder next to it, then the third. By the time I was placing the 6th and final boulder, there were at least 20 neighbors watching, and several of them were openly laughing. Patricia came running out of her house. "You cannot put those on my lawn. This is my private property." "Actually, Patricia, I checked the plat map. Your property line starts 5 feet back from the sidewalk. These boulders are positioned on that 5-foot strip, which is designated as common area for utility access and easements. Same as the strip where you put the boulders in front of my driveway. So technically, they are still on HOA common property. I am just relocating them to a different section of common property." "This is harassment." "No, this is me exercising the same authority you claimed to have when you blocked my driveway. If the HOA can place boulders on common property in front of my house, I can relocate them to common property in front of your house. It is all in the covenant, Patricia. You should read it sometime." I loaded the excavator back onto the trailer, while Patricia stood in her yard, staring at the 6 massive boulders now decorating her lawn. The crowd of neighbors was dispersing, many of them smiling and a few giving me thumbs up as they walked away. Marcus drove me back to my house where I parked the excavator in my now accessible driveway. My truck was finally free. I backed it out, parked it on the street, and took a long look at my handiwork. The boulder barrier was gone, and my driveway looked exactly as it had before Patricia's power trip. I knew this was not over. Patricia was not the type to let something like this go. But I felt a deep satisfaction knowing I had stood up to her bullying and won, at least for the moment. The next morning, I woke up to find a certified letter taped to my front door. It was from the HOA board, signed by all 5 members, including Patricia. The letter informed me that I was being fined $5,000 for unauthorized removal and relocation of HOA property and destruction of common area landscaping. Additionally, my hearing request had been denied because I had acted in bad faith by taking unilateral action before the board could render a decision. I called Jennifer Wu, the real estate attorney, and read her the letter over the phone. "They are overplaying their hand," she said. "The fine is almost certainly unenforceable. You followed the procedure outlined in the covenant, and they are retaliating against you for exercising your rights. This is actually helpful for building a selective enforcement case." What should I do? Write a formal response disputing the fine and demanding an emergency board meeting. Under Arizona law, HOAs have to follow their own procedures, and most covenants require a hearing before significant fines can be assessed. If they refuse, we can file for an injunction. I spent that afternoon drafting a detailed response letter. I cited multiple sections of the covenant, included photographs of my blocked driveway and the current location of the boulders, and demanded an emergency board meeting within 7 days. I also noted that at least 11 other houses in Whispering Pines had driveways with identical setbacks to mine, and I requested an explanation for why I was being selectively targeted. I sent the letter via certified mail to all 5 board members and copied Jennifer Wu on everything. 3 days later, I received a response. The board agreed to hold an emergency meeting, scheduled for the following Monday at 7 in the evening at the community center. All homeowners were invited to attend, as per the open meeting requirements in the covenant. That Monday, I showed up 30 minutes early with a briefcase full of documents, photographs, and highlighted copies of the covenant. The community center's main room was set up with a long table at the front for the board members and rows of folding chairs for residents. By the time the meeting started, there were at least 60 people in attendance, which was remarkable given that most monthly meetings drew maybe a dozen. Patricia sat at the center of the table, flanked by the other 4 board members. Tom Reynolds, a retired accountant who seemed like he would rather be anywhere else, Diane Foster, a middle-aged woman who ran a home daycare, Craig Martinez, a pharmaceutical sales rep who traveled constantly, and Betty Sullivan, the oldest member of the board at 82, who mostly nodded along with whatever Patricia said. Patricia called the meeting to order and immediately launched into a prepared statement about the importance of following rules and respecting HOA authority. She characterized my actions as vigilante justice and claimed I had set a dangerous precedent that could lead to chaos and anarchy in Whispering Pines. When she finally finished, she asked if I had anything to say in my defense. I stood up and walked to the front of the room. I want to start by asking a simple question. Why was my driveway suddenly a problem after 3 years? The driveway was professionally installed by the original developer, approved by the county, and certified by the HOA before I purchased the house. Nothing about the driveway has changed since 2019. So what changed? Patricia started to respond, but I held up my hand. I am not finished. I have here photographs of 11 other houses in Whispering Pines with identical driveway setbacks. Some of these homes are owned by people in this room right now. Why have none of them received violation notices? Why was I specifically targeted? I placed the photographs on the table in front of the board members. Tom Reynolds picked one up and studied it, frowning. Furthermore, I continued, I have documented evidence that I voted against a dues increase proposed by President Hendricks 6 months ago. Shortly after that vote, I began receiving unusual violation notices for minor issues that had never been problems before. My mailbox was supposedly the wrong color, even though it has been the same color since I moved in. My trash cans were visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though they were in the same location I had kept them for years. And now, suddenly, my driveway is a code violation serious enough to warrant blocking it with massive boulders. I turned to face the audience. How many other people here have had similar experiences after disagreeing with President Hendricks? At least a dozen hands went up. I saw Frank Simmons, my neighbor who had warned me about Patricia's retaliation. I saw the Mitchells, who had apparently decided not to sell after all. I saw people I had never spoken to before, all raising their hands to indicate they had been targeted. Patricia's face was bright red. This is ridiculous. We enforce the rules fairly and consistently. Then explain the photographs, I said. Explain why 11 other homeowners have the exact same violation, but only I received a notice. Explain why the boulders were installed without any hearing or due process, in direct violation of Section 19 of the Covenant, which requires board approval for any common area modification costing more than $500. Tom Reynolds cleared his throat. Patricia, did you get board approval for the boulder installation? It was an enforcement action, not a modification, Patricia said quickly. I acted within my authority as president. Actually, you did not, I said. Section 31 clearly states that enforcement actions involving physical modifications to common areas require a majority vote of the board. Did you hold a vote? The silence that followed was deafening. Tom Reynolds looked at Patricia with growing suspicion. We did not vote on this. Because it was not required, Patricia insisted. The boulders were placed to enforce an existing violation. Diane Foster spoke up for the first time. But Aaron is right. Section 31 is pretty clear. We should have voted on this. I could see the board fracturing in real time. Craig Martinez was nodding in agreement. Even Betty Sullivan looked uncertain. I move that we rescind the $5,000 fine against Aaron Dalton, Tom Reynolds said suddenly. The board did not follow proper procedure, and the selective enforcement concerns are legitimate. Second, Diane Foster said immediately. Patricia looked panicked. We cannot just rescind a duly imposed fine. There are procedures. You are right, there are procedures, Tom said, and you did not follow them, all in favor of rescinding the fine. 4 hands went up. Only Patricia voted against. The motion passed, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, but I was not done yet. "I appreciate the board's decision," I said, "but I want to address the underlying issue. My driveway was approved by the previous HOA board in the county. It meets all applicable building codes. The only reason it is supposedly in violation is because of an arbitrary interpretation of setback requirements that is not being enforced consistently across the community. I am requesting that the board formally grandfather all existing driveways built by the original developer and drop this violation notice." Tom Reynolds looked relieved to have a reasonable solution. "I move that we grandfather all driveways installed by the original developer, provided they meet county building codes and do not present a safety hazard." "Second," Craig Martinez said. Patricia was fuming. "This sets a terrible precedent. We cannot just ignore the covenant whenever it is inconvenient." "We are not ignoring it," Tom said. "We are interpreting it reasonably and applying it consistently. That is what we should have been doing all along. All in favor?" 4 hands went up again. Patricia was outvoted. The meeting continued for another hour, with various homeowners bringing up concerns about selective enforcement and Patricia's leadership. By the end of the night, there was a motion on the floor to hold a special election for HOA president. That motion also passed 4-1. As people filed out of the community center, several neighbors stopped to thank me for standing up to Patricia. Frank Simmons clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You just did what the rest of us were too scared to do." I drove home feeling vindicated but exhausted. The Boulders were still sitting on the common area in front of Patricia's house, and I was not sure what would happen to them. But at least my driveway was clear, the fine was rescinded, and Patricia's grip on the HOA was finally loosening. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of a diesel engine again. I looked out my window and saw a landscaping truck in front of Patricia's house. Workers were loading the boulders onto a flatbed using a small crane. I watched as they drove away, presumably taking the rocks to some warehouse or back to wherever Patricia had originally rented them from. I made coffee and sat on my back deck, enjoying the quiet morning. My phone rang around 9. It was Tom Reynolds. "Hey, Aaron, I wanted to give you a heads up. Patricia submitted her resignation this morning, effective immediately. She is also moving out of Whispering Pines. Apparently, she cannot stand the thought of living here after what happened at the meeting." Wow, I did not expect that. Neither did I, but honestly, it is probably for the best. She was driving this community into the ground with her authoritarian nonsense. We are going to need an interim president until the special election. Would you be interested? I laughed. "Tom, I appreciate the offer, but I am a contractor, not an HOA president. I just wanted to park in my own driveway." "Fair enough. Well, the offer stands if you change your mind. And Aaron, thanks for having the guts to stand up to her. A lot of us knew what she was doing was wrong, but we did not want to rock the boat." After we hung up, I sat with my coffee and thought about everything that had happened over the past few weeks. I had come very close to just paying the $10,000 to recut my driveway, or even selling my house and moving somewhere without an HOA. But something in me had refused to back down, and that decision had changed everything. The special election happened 6 weeks later. A retired schoolteacher named Dorothy Marsh won the presidency on a platform of common sense and community cooperation. One of her first acts was to hire a professional management company to handle routine enforcement, taking the personal vendetta element out of HOA governance. She also organized a committee to review the covenant and identify outdated or unreasonable provisions. Life in Whispering Pines gradually returned to normal, except it was actually better than before. People felt like they could enjoy their homes without constantly looking over their shoulders for violation notices. The community pool got more use. Block parties started happening again. It turned out that when you removed the atmosphere of fear and petty tyranny, people actually liked living in a planned community. I ran into Patricia one more time before she moved out. It was at the grocery store in Scottsdale, about 3 months after the board meeting. She was in the produce section, carefully selecting avocados when she looked up and saw me. For a moment, I thought she might just turn and walk away, but instead, she surprised me. "I suppose you are happy," she said quietly. "I am happy that I can park in my driveway again," I replied. "I am sorry it had to get so confrontational." She set down the avocado she was holding. I was trying to maintain standards. You people do not understand what happens when a community lets things slide. Property values decline, the neighborhood goes downhill, and before you know it, you are living in a slum. Patricia, we are talking about a driveway being a few inches wider than some arbitrary measurement in a covenant. That is not going to turn Whispering Pines into a slum. It is about respect for the rules, she said, and I could hear the same rigid certainty that had defined her entire tenure as HOA president. If people can just ignore the rules whenever they want, what is the point of having them? Rules are important, I agreed, but so is common sense, fairness, and not using your authority to punish people for disagreeing with you. Her jaw tightened. I never did that. Patricia, we both know that is not true. But it does not matter anymore. You are moving on, and Whispering Pines is moving on. I hope you find somewhere that makes you happy. She did not respond, just turned back to her avocados. I finished my shopping and left, and that was the last time I ever saw Patricia Hendricks. Over the following year, Whispering Pines transformed in subtle but meaningful ways. The new management company was professional but not draconian. They sent out friendly reminders about things like mowing schedules and holiday decoration guidelines, but they did not go looking for reasons to fine people. Dorothy Marsh proved to be an excellent president, organized and fair-minded without being obsessive. My business continued to thrive, and I stayed busy with contracting jobs all over the Phoenix metro area. The excavator that had moved those boulders became something of a legend in the neighborhood. People would joke about it at community events, and more than once I heard someone reference the Great Boulder Rebellion of 2026 when discussing HOA overreach. About 18 months after Patricia's resignation, I was invited to speak at a regional HOA conference in Tempe. The organizers had heard about what happened in Whispering Pines and wanted me to share lessons learned about board accountability and homeowner rights. I was hesitant at first, but Dorothy convinced me it was important. The conference was held at a hotel near Arizona State University, and I was surprised by how many people attended my session. There were board members, homeowners, property managers, and even a few attorneys. I told the story of the boulders, the retaliation, and how standing up to unjust enforcement had ultimately made my community stronger. During the question and answer period, a woman in her 40s raised her hand. What would you say to homeowners who are afraid of retaliation if they speak up? I would say that your fear is probably justified, I answered honestly. HOAs can make your life miserable if you have a board that abuses its power. But I would also say that you are not alone. In my case, there were dozens of other homeowners who had been targeted the same way I was. We just did not know about each other until we all spoke up at the same time. Find allies, document everything, know your covenant and your state laws, and if you have to fight, fight smart and fight within the system. Another hand went up, this one from a man who identified himself as an HOA attorney. You got lucky that your board came to its senses. What would you have done if they had not rescinded the fine? I was prepared to file a lawsuit, I said. I had already consulted with an attorney, and we were building a case for selective enforcement and retaliatory action. It would have been expensive and time-consuming, but some things are worth fighting for. The right to use your own driveway is one of them. The session ran over by 20 minutes because people kept asking questions and sharing their own HOA horror stories. It was simultaneously depressing and empowering to hear how common these problems were, but also to see people actively looking for solutions. After the conference, I went back to my normal life. I finished several large projects, took a week-long vacation to Colorado, and even started dating someone I met at a job site in Mesa. Her name was Francine Stone, and she was an interior designer working on the same commercial renovation I was contracted for. We hit it off immediately, bonding over shared experiences with difficult clients and a love of good Mexican food. Francine had never lived in an HOA community and found my Boulder story hilarious. You actually drove an excavator through the neighborhood and dumped rocks on her lawn? That is the most aggressive, passive-aggressive thing I have ever heard. It was not passive-aggressive, I protested. It was just aggressive, but legally aggressive. She laughed. I love that you found a loophole in the HOA rules and used it to move boulders. Most people would have just called a lawyer and spent years in litigation. I almost did that, but something about those boulders sitting in front of my driveway just made me so angry. It was such a petty, vindictive thing to do. I wanted Patricia to understand what it felt like to have someone mess with your property over some nonsense technicality. Did she understand? I do not know. I do not think Patricia is capable of seeing things from anyone else's perspective, but at least she is not tormenting the people of Whispering Pines anymore. Francine moved into my house about a year after we started dating. The HOA required us to submit an occupancy notification form, which was a minor annoyance, but nothing compared to the Patricia era. Dorothy Marsh sent us a welcome basket with a bottle of wine and a note saying she was happy to see love blooming in Whispering Pines. We got married the following spring in a small ceremony at a resort in Sedona. Frank Simmons came to the wedding, as did Tom Reynolds, Dorothy Marsh, and several other neighbors who had become genuine friends over the years. Marcus was my best man, and he gave a toast about the time we hauled an excavator through a residential neighborhood to move 6 boulders as an act of civil disobedience. "To Aaron," Marcus said, raising his glass, "the only man I know who responded to HOA tyranny with heavy machinery, may your driveway forever remain accessible, and may you never again have to fight for the basic right to park your own truck." Everyone laughed and cheered. It was a perfect moment, surrounded by people who understood the absurdity of what I had been through and appreciated the principle I had stood up for. Life continued peacefully in Whispering Pines. The community thrived under new leadership that actually cared about homeowners rather than just enforcing rules for the sake of enforcement. The covenant got updated to remove some of the more ridiculous provisions, including the driveway setback requirement that had started the whole mess. I sometimes wondered what happened to Patricia Hendricks. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had moved to a retirement community in Sun City, which seemed fitting. Hopefully, she found other retirees who shared her passion for regulations and order, and hopefully she was just a regular resident rather than someone in a position of authority. As for me, I learned several valuable lessons from the experience. First, never let anyone bully you into submission, even if they claim to have authority on their side. Second, always read the fine print in your HOA covenant because it can be used as both a weapon and a shield. Third, heavy machinery solves certain problems very effectively as long as you use it legally and strategically. But the most important lesson was about community. Before the boulder incident, I had been a relatively isolated resident of Whispering Pines. I knew my immediate neighbors, but did not really engage with the broader community. The fight with Patricia had forced me to connect with other homeowners, attend board meetings, and take an active role in how the neighborhood was governed. What I discovered was that most people in Whispering Pines were reasonable, decent folks who just wanted to live their lives without unnecessary drama or interference. The problem had been a single person who had let a small amount of power go to her head. Once that person was removed from the equation, the natural goodness of the community could flourish. 5 years after the boulder incident, Francine and I were expecting our first child. We had considered moving to a larger house in a different neighborhood, but we ultimately decided to stay in Whispering Pines. The community had become our home in a way that went beyond just owning property there. We had real friendships, genuine connections, and a sense of belonging that would be hard to replicate elsewhere. I was sitting on the back deck one evening, watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of orange and purple, when Francine came out and sat beside me. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Just how different things could have been," I said. If I had backed down when Patricia put those boulders in front of my driveway, I probably would have ended up selling the house and leaving. I would have let her win, and I would have missed out on all of this. Francine took my hand. "But you did not back down. You fought back, and you won. And now we have this amazing life in a community that actually functions the way it is supposed to." "I got lucky," I said. "The board could have sided with Patricia. The police could have arrested me for moving the boulders. A lot of things could have gone wrong. But they did not. And you know what I think? I think you made your own luck by being smart about it. You researched the laws, you documented everything, you found the loopholes, and you acted decisively. That was not luck. That was strategy." She was probably right. Looking back, I could see that every decision I had made had been calculated to put me in the strongest possible position. I had not just reacted emotionally to Patricia's provocation. I had thought through the consequences, consulted with experts, and executed a plan that was risky but defensible. The baby arrived that fall, a healthy boy we named Andrew. Dorothy Marsh organized a neighborhood welcome party, and it felt like the entire community turned out to celebrate. People brought gifts, food, and congratulations. Frank Simmons gave little Andrew a stuffed excavator toy, which made everyone laugh. "For when he is old enough to move boulders," Frank said with a wink. As I held my son and looked around at the faces of my neighbors and friends, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Not just for how things had turned out, but for the lesson I had learned about standing up for what was right. I wanted Andrew to grow up in a world where people did not just accept injustice or arbitrary authority. I wanted him to know that sometimes you have to fight, but you should fight smart and fight within the rules whenever possible. The excavator that had moved those boulders was long since sold. I had upgraded to a newer model for my business, and the old Bobcat E35 had gone to another contractor in Tucson. But the memory of what it had accomplished remained vivid. Those 6 boulders had been more than just obstacles in my driveway. They had been a symbol of unchecked authority, petty retaliation, and the abuse of power. Moving them had been about more than just reclaiming access to my garage. It had been about asserting my rights as a homeowner, challenging unjust enforcement, and refusing to be intimidated by someone who thought her position gave her the right to make my life difficult. Years later, I still get calls from homeowners in other communities who are dealing with their own HOA nightmares. They find my name through the conference circuit or through online forums where people share stories about standing up to abusive boards. I always try to help when I can, offering advice about documentation, legal strategies, and how to build coalitions with other affected homeowners. Some of these people win their fights. Others end up selling their homes and moving somewhere without an HOA. A few even manage to get their board members recalled or forced to resign, just like what happened with Patricia. Each story is different, but they all share common themes: power-hungry board members, selective enforcement, retaliation against dissent, and homeowners who just want to live in peace without constantly looking over their shoulders. I have become something of an accidental activist for HOA reform, not because I set out to be one, but because my story resonated with so many people who were going through similar struggles. I have testified before the Arizona State Legislature twice about proposed HOA reform bills. I have been quoted in newspaper articles about HOA abuses. I have even appeared on a local news segment about homeowner rights. Through it all, I have tried to stay grounded in the original principle that motivated me: fairness. I do not think HOAs are inherently bad. In fact, I think they serve an important purpose in maintaining community standards and property values. But like any institution with power over people's lives, they need accountability, transparency, and limits on what they can do. The Boulder incident taught me that sometimes the best way to deal with unreasonable authority is to use the system's own rules against it. Patricia thought she could hide behind the covenant and use it as a weapon to punish me for opposing her. What she did not count on was that I would actually read the covenant, understand it better than she did, and find ways to turn her own tactics back on her. It was a valuable lesson, one that I've carried with me in other areas of my life. Whether dealing with difficult clients, navigating building codes, or resolving disputes with subcontractors, I have learned that knowledge is power and that understanding the rules gives you leverage even when you are not the one in charge. Whispering Pines continues to thrive under sensible governance. Property values have increased steadily. The community has won awards for its landscaping and amenities. New families move in regularly, and the turnover rate has dropped significantly since the Patricia era. People actually want to live here now, rather than counting the days until they can sell and escape. Dorothy Marsh eventually stepped down as president after serving 2 successful terms, and she was replaced by a younger resident named Kevin Park, who brought fresh energy and ideas to the role. The board continues to function well, with open communication, reasonable enforcement, and a genuine commitment to serving homeowners rather than ruling over them. I still live in the same house on Oakmont Drive. My driveway, the one that caused all the trouble, remains exactly as it was built in 2019. No boulders block my access. No violation notices arrive in my mailbox. I park my truck in the garage every night without giving it a second thought, which is exactly how it should be. Sometimes when I'm backing out of the driveway in the morning, I glance at the spot where those 6 massive boulders once sat. I remember the anger I felt when I saw them being unloaded, the determination that drove me to fight back, and the satisfaction of watching them being placed on Patricia's lawn as a message that bullies do not always win. It was not the most mature response, I will admit that. There were probably better ways to handle the situation. But it was effective, it was legal, and it sent a clear signal that I was not going to be pushed around. More importantly, it inspired other homeowners to stand up for their rights, and that ultimately led to positive change for the entire community. Looking back now, I'm grateful for the whole experience, as frustrating and stressful as it was at the time. It forced me to become more engaged, more knowledgeable, and more willing to fight for what I believed in. It connected me with people who became genuine friends. It taught me lessons about courage, strategy, and the importance of standing up to injustice even when it would be easier to just go along. And it gave me a great story to tell at dinner parties, one that always gets a laugh and usually leads to other people sharing their own HOA horror stories. There is something cathartic about those conversations, a shared understanding among people who have dealt with petty bureaucrats and unreasonable rules. My son, Andrew, is now in kindergarten, a bright and curious kid who loves construction vehicles and building things with blocks. Sometimes he plays with the stuffed excavator Frank Simmons gave him, making engine noises and pretending to dig up the backyard. He does not know the significance of that toy yet, but someday I will tell him the story of how his dad used a real excavator to stand up to an unjust HOA president. I will tell him that standing up for yourself is important, but so is being smart about how you do it. I will tell him that rules matter, but fairness matters more. I will tell him that sometimes you have to fight, but you should always try to fight within the system first. And I will tell him that 6 decorative boulders, properly positioned, can change everything. The community of Whispering Pines represents something important to me now, beyond just being the place where I live. It is proof that ordinary people can push back against abuse of authority and win. It is evidence that communities function better when they are governed by common sense rather than rigid adherence to arbitrary rules. It is a reminder that home should be a place where you feel safe and welcome, not a place where you constantly worry about violation notices and fines. Francine often jokes that I am the only person she knows who solved an HOA dispute with an excavator, and she is probably right about that. Most people would have called a lawyer, filed a lawsuit, and spent years fighting in court. Some people would have just given up and moved away. But I chose a different path, one that was risky and unconventional, but ultimately effective. The boulders are long gone, scattered to wherever decorative landscaping rocks go when they are no longer needed. Patricia Hendricks is gone too, living out her retirement somewhere else, hopefully not making anyone's life miserable. The board that enabled her has been completely replaced by people who actually care about the community. What remains is a neighborhood that learned an important lesson about accountability, a group of homeowners who are not afraid to speak up when something is wrong, and one contractor who will forever be known as the guy who moved 6 boulders with an excavator as an act of calculated civil disobedience. It is not the legacy I expected when I moved to Whispering Pines back in 2022, but it is the one I have, and I'm proud of it. Because at the end of the day, I did not just fight for my right to use my driveway. I fought for the principle that homeowners should not have to live in fear of petty tyrants who abuse their authority. And that is a fight worth winning, even if it means firing up an excavator and moving some very large rocks.